Good evening. Uh, we are going to have a wonderful talk by my good friend, Dr. Vineet Gupta, who was introduced to you all. As an immunologist and a clinical immunologist, good, robust immune system is very essential in cancer surveillance. And immune system can be significantly affected by stress. Even a bad thought can make at least 10 different gene expression changes. And like exercise, a positive thinking can make a positive impact on the gene expression. So even small negative thought can influence how our genes are expressed. So with this knowledge, I know that Vineet Gupta is going to give us a beautiful talk. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for. Hello? Audible? Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for being here. It's a rainy day in Bangalore, so I think this is a large audience. I hope I do justice to the remit which has been given to me. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much, Nanda, for giving me this remit. And I did accept the remit with the caveat that I need to read about this. I'm a mainstream oncologist. So this is a topic which is as foreign to me as to most others in the room, maybe less so to some, I guess. So I had to study a lot, and I hope that what I'm going to tell you will add to your knowledge base and hopefully fix the stress in your life as well. So stress is of a vital public health importance. The first Wednesday of November in the US is celebrated as a National Stress Awareness Day. Unfortunately, in India, we are stressed every day. So I think every day is a National Stress Awareness Day. Interestingly, the last Thursday of November is also called the Thanksgiving Day. So Thanksgiving and stress go together. That's the understanding. This has been my position. This is a disclosure, but this has been my position for a couple of weeks now. I've been very stressed about this talk because this is not mainstream for me. So I had to study, and this is how I looked a couple of days just before the talk. As I said, this is not a mainstream talk for me, so I had to rely on the research of several giants from Stanford: Andrew Huberman, Dave Furman, David Spiegel. At a University of Washington, we had Jay Nietzsche, who's a professor of ophthalmology. At the USC Brain Research Institute, Jack Feldman. So I stand on the shoulders of all these giants, and all the errors and omissions in the talk that follows are mine. All the credit really goes to these people who have spent eons of years, decades researching into stress and what it does to our body. As I said, this is not a mainstream topic for me, but I have been very fascinated by the workings of the human mind, the brain, from way back. So this topic really grew with me as I was in the grammar school. And the first time I realized this was when I read this quote from Emily Dickinson, the British poet: "The brain is wider than the sky and deeper than the sea," and essentially alluding to the boundless, unbound potential of the human brain and how it connects with the unbounded God. And I think this thought remained with me, although its importance I didn't understand for much later. As I entered medical school in the States, Joel Elks, I don't know how many of you know him. He's the guy behind chlorpromazine. Some of the elder physicians like me would know chlorpromazine was a neuropsychotic drug. And this is what his view was. Medicine's view of sickness has been a continuous conversation from between, without, and from within. The visible, the tangible, and the intangible. And I always used to wonder when I was in medical school that what is that we see and what is that we know are the same things which are happening in the human body. How many of you know these guys? There's a reward. I think Nanda is giving out gifts as well. If you can tell me who these people are. This is Robert De Niro, yes, and Dharmanand Garu gets a prize. And this is Robin Williams. This is from the famous 1990 movie Awakenings by Penny Marsh, who was the director. And this movie has a very profound influence on me. I still remember the VCR days. These are the VCR movies. And this movie had a profound influence because it was based on a novel by Oliver Sacks, Oliver Sacks was a neurologist. And at some point in time, a quote comes in, which is this: the human spirit is infinitely more powerful than any drug, and that is what needs to be nourished. For a very long time, I was early on into medical school. This is my first year in medical school, or second year maybe, and I used to wonder, what are they trying to say? And I could never figure it out until much later. And I'm telling you all this because these are the reasons I agreed to give this talk, because this topic holds great import to me. As I moved into the US, I attended this exhibition at the National Institute of Health in 1996, which was Emotions and Disease. And this explored the tenuous relationship between how what we feel influences what our body does. And this exhibition, which was curated beautifully, and I still have vivid memories of going to Bethesda, told me that I was on the right track, and I was onto something. Fast forward into my fellowship days, I interviewed at City of Hope Cancer Center, Duarte, California, not very far from Disneyland. And Sam Golter was one of the executive directors. And this is the Golter Gate, which is right there in the Rose Garden. And this says, there is no profit in curing the body if in the process we destroy the soul. And I knew that my choice of being an oncologist was a good one. I knew that I was on the right track because my heart and my brain were in consonance together. And I knew that this is where I want to be. Obviously, City of Hope was a very difficult cancer center to actually get in, and I didn't get in, just so that you guys know. We can skip this slide in the interest of time, although this hieroglyphics from the pre-pandemic era is from an exhibit in Lisbon, which I attended several years ago, just before the pandemic, which is Brain is Wider Than the Sky, showing the origin, the complexity, the evolution, the beauty of the brain through 3D infographics. Okay, this is what we are going to really talk about, how the brain and the body interact. So over the course, and now fasten your seatbelts, please, over the course of next 20, 25 minutes, I'm going to take you through a whirlwind. Okay, we are going to be talking about the story of the stress. We're talking about what stress is. So who are the actors? What is the anatomy? What is the physiology? And finally, going to give you some solutions which you can put to use on a Sunday morning. How is that you can ward off stress? This is the era of pandemics. Everybody's talking about pandemics. So let's start with the cancer pandemic. Cancer is often called the pathology of the century. And truly so, 40% of the people that we know of will eventually get cancer. 40% of the people throughout the world will eventually get cancer by 2035. And this is the NCI statistic. So clearly, treating our way out of cancer is not an option. You can't treat 40% of the world's population at about 4 billion. That's just not going to happen. So prevention is the way to go. Last year and a better part of this year has unleashed stress and uncertainty of unparalleled proportions on everybody. We have all been subject to economic disruption, social unrest, political tumble. We have all faced like a full stop, a one in a lifetime century event. And this is pretty much what has shaped us, shaped all of us in this room, the adults in this room, into what I call the COVID generation. And we have all suffered pandemic anxiety, from wearing masks to not going to the hospitals to not socializing. So clearly, stress has been a part and parcel of our lives, if not before, at least in the last 2 years. Now, whenever we talk about stress as being a modern disease, an affluenza. I heard people saying that when we were in the village, we didn't have stress. Things were simpler. The reality is not that. The stress has been a part and parcel of human life ever since man lived in the caves. When we were foraging for food and we were moving around in small bands, stress was a part and parcel of our lives. The stressors were different. We were climactic stress. There was stress of predatory animals. As a consequence of which, there was a heightened sense of environment, right? Now, as we fast forward into life, what has happened is those circuits have remained intact. The stressors have changed to cell phones. I see Somashekar on the cell phone. So we are all wired and tired, as a consequence of which we have become what I like to call a stressed depressed, and an obsessed generation. I have yet to see if actually cell phones and being connected has made a significant impact in survival of cancer patients or patients in general. And I would imagine that the number is very small, but we remain stressed, depressed, and obsessed. So stress entered into the medical literature in the 1930s, and people started talking about stress in the 1970s. But stress to me is at best an ambiguous explanation, right? This cartoon captures it. We know what stress is, but it's very hard to define. Nanda, can you define stress? No, it's very hard. It's very hard to get a tangible definition. We tend to look at stress as an unwanted feeling, a feeling of being traumatized, a feeling of being overwhelmed, fatigued, tired, so on and so forth. But if you look at some of the articles of people who really created ideas for the modern world, and Richard Schroeder is one such guy from US, and he said, stress is a very popular word. It's like Coke and Visa card, it's very popular. But stress is very hard to define. And stress is a word which really sublimes all languages. It is same in Punjabi as it is in Kannada, Nantumba stress ide. It is same in Telugu, it's same in French, it's same in German. So stress does not really have its own lexicon. And obviously, when we are overwhelmed, we are tired, fatigued, that's all bandicooted together as stress. Now, just to get a formal definition in place before we move forward, stress is a process whereby a person perceives and responds to events that they judge to be overwhelming or threatening to their well-being. The critical element here, as you can see, is how we judge the event. So when this talk came through, there were two ways I could look at it. One was, oh my God, I would look like an idiot in front of so many intelligent and famous people, and hence shy away and being paralyzed by fear. Or I could take up the challenge and say, hey, gee, this is a great opportunity to read about stress literature and take up this option. So I think stress in that sense is how you judge the event. So it is like two sides of a coin. So if you look at the Chinese alphabet, the way they write crisis is in actually two brush strokes. So danger and opportunity go together. Stress is like that. It's two sides of the same coin. Janus, we are going to be heading into New Year. It's based, January is named after Janus, the Roman god, the mythical Roman god having two faces, the face of the beginning, a face of the end, a face of start, a face of stop, a face of war, and a face of peace. So clearly it is a two-sided venture. Stress isn't necessarily evil. It's like friction. Too much friction, you can't walk, you're paralyzed. Too less of friction, you can't walk, you'll slip through. So stress is a double-edged sword. So stress essentially, as I said, primes you for performance, okay? It primes you for performance. Too much of it, it becomes distress and you're paralyzed. Too less, you lack the motivation. This is the optimal level. And this is the Yerkes-Dodson curve from 1908, when they actually said the performance and stress follow a parabolic inverted U-shaped curve. So obviously, as you can surmise, I am right here at the distress level. Now, not everything can be encapsulated, but this is a slide which I've borrowed. As you can see, stress also means health damaging behavior, diet, lack of physical activity, alcohol, smoking, loneliness, circadian disruption, residents and surgeons working at night, gynecologists delivering babies at night, jet lag, shift workers, noisy, polluted neighborhoods. These are all stress. Stress is not only about what we talked about. This qualifies as stress as well. Hans Selye was an Hungarian physician who was trained largely in Canada at the McGill and established the Institute of Stress. And he was the first one to coin the use of the word stress as GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome, a response of the body to demands placed upon it. It first appeared in Nature. He's the father of stress. Very interestingly, he had 3 marriages and had a horrible life himself. So that's just an anecdote. Bruce McKibben, there is no talk on stress that is complete without an ode to this man. This man was a great neuroendocrinologist out of Rockefeller in New York. And Bruce McKibben first figured out how stress hormones can refigure. Stress hormones released from throughout the body can refigure the neural connections in the brain. He first time showed that there are receptors in the brain that respond to the hormones produced elsewhere. So a great man wrote this book, The Age of Stress as We Know It, a must read for many. So are you stressed or stressed out? Mr. Sethi, are you stressed or stressed out? Neither. Neither. So he is in a perfect allostasis, which means when the body stressor and the ability to adapt are in consonance, in parallel, perfect equilibrium, that is Mr. Sethi, that is allostasis. On the other hand, if I speak to Nanda, who has been the chairperson and organizer, and Rajiv and others as well, I would imagine that they have suffered a lot of allostatic load, which means a significant amount of load. The body is still coping, but if this conference was like an ASCO extending on for 4 days or 5 days, they would have to pay a price of it, which is called allostatic load. This is the problem, not this. When you have an allostatic load, when the body extracts a price out of your stress, that's the problem. And this is what Bruce McKibben told us. Stress is positive, it can be tolerable, it can be toxic. A bad boss is toxic stress. A positive stress is me giving a lecture here. I had to study for it, but it's great. A tolerable stress is a corporate hospital asking you for MIS every month. So that's how I would look at it. The story of stress, as I said, fasten your seatbelts. Oh. I'm going to take you through a panoramic 30,000 feet view of how medicine evolved over 25 centuries. So we are covering 2,500 years in this one single slide. So the church used to be the predominant doctor in the ancient times. All illnesses were due to sin, all prescriptions were prayers, and medicine was a matter of faith. Hippocrates took away that mantle from the church and said, illnesses happen because of humoral disequilibrium. And this philosophy continued much until Galen came. Now, Galen was a Roman physician who was born 500 years after the death of actually Hippocrates, after Christ was born, right about here. Right? And Galen was the one who said that the concept of cancer might be in some way related to stress or other emotional factors. This is his magnum opus on tumors. And he talked about sad women, melancholic women who had more of black bile, were more susceptible to cancer. This is probably the earliest recorded literature showing that there is link between emotions, stress, and cancer. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hindi. We like to call a disease called lavaria, and in medical school, it used to be a very popular. When we can't find an organic basis of disease in a young guy or a girl, it was commonly said, oh, isko to lavaria hua. This person has lavaria. So lavaria has a basis, and Galen was a specialist in diagnosis of lavaria and was known as the love sickness doctor. Remember, Galen is not an ordinary soul. He influenced medicine from 2nd century much until after Renaissance, which is until the 17th century. So very, very prominent man in the field of modern medicine, but also called the love sickness doctor. So is there something of a cancer personality? I've been talking to people and seem to get the sense of it. Oh, you are always stressed. You are likely to have cancer. Can we say that? Can we say that you have a cancer personality? Like we say you have a AA or a AAA battery size, a AA personality or a AAA personality. Do we have a cancer personality? And I think science does not bear that out. And that is what makes my talk so difficult, is to draw out on foils of science, which are as important and relevant to today's talk. So personality does not influence cancer. Hypothesis should be retired. This is the headlines of a New York Times a few years ago, I think a decade ago, based upon this study, American Journal of Epidemiology, which followed 60,000 people in the Nordic countries, I think Finland and Denmark. And they concluded, and they concluded for people with cancer, the findings mean they should not think that their personality traits may have affected their cancer or cancer prognosis. People with cancer do not have to feel they should adopt an outlook that is not true to them. So this positive washing is probably not required according to the study. And that is why this topic makes such an interesting topic for me. No, I have 25 minutes. So this is Siddharth Mukherjee. We all recognize him from his book, Emperor of Maladies. And this is an interview he gave a couple of years ago based upon this particular study, which is a positive attitude does not cure cancer any more than a negative attitude, causes it, right? So everybody in the room, everybody in the public, we encourage to get positive. So we all talk about the fact that there's a close relationship between health, disease, and emotions, but the scientific community at large is very skeptical about it, right? So where does the whole thing lie? And this is the scientific data linking stress and cancer. Now, if you look at this is a Lancet paper from Harvard a couple of years ago, and this explores the fact that cardiovascular disease, heart disease of many sorts, is increased, and in patients where the fear center, the smoke alarm in the brain called the amygdala, has increased basal activity. So clearly alluding to a linkage between the fear center, the stress center, and heart disease. Now, we all recognize this emoji from WhatsApp, I guess, the heartbreak, right? So there is something called a broken heart syndrome. And the broken heart syndrome happens more often in women, naturally so, sometimes I feel, disproportionately, unless you have a female boss, which they're heartless, I guess. But it's triggered by stressful events, bankruptcy, divorce, death of a loved one. And it has been shown that the amygdala, the fear center, clearly is hyperactive and activated in that. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the data between psychological factors and the predictive capacity of the psychological factors to cause heart disease is very well defined. The data on cancer, apart from what I've quoted, is not so. So we have to rely on anecdotes. And here are some of the anecdotes. I want you to review them. This is from New York Times. It talks about a man who had resistant schizophrenia, a mental health disorder, which could not be treated. Unfortunately, during the course of his treatment, he got leukemia, underwent a bone marrow transplant, and to the surprise of the psychiatrist, Dr. Miyaka in Japan, somewhere in Japan, his schizophrenia was gone. So he got schizophrenia, he got cancer, and then he got cured, was the screaming headlines in New York Times a couple of years ago. Lawrence Lee Shan has worked, he's now dead, but had worked with cancer patients for several decades, father of mind-body therapy. This is a JNCI, Journal of National Cancer Institute, a very high-impact journal monograph, Psychological State as Factors in Development of Malignant Disease. And this is what he concludes. There seems to be a correlation between neoplastic disease and certain types of psychological situations. So the question that needs to be asked is, does stress contribute to increased incidence of cancer? Will it make my cancer worse? That's the question that needs to be asked, right? And the data is not clear, but here is a meta-analysis of close to 600 odd studies from a group of researchers at University College London, epidemiologist. Dr. Chida is now actually back home, Japan. And what they said was, out of these 548 studies, in 165 studies, they showed higher cancer incidence in initially healthy population of stressed individuals. Similarly, in 330 studies out of these 548, they showed poorer survival. In those who had cancer and who were stressed, they tend to live shorter lives. So yes, we have some data. It's not categorical, it's not definitive, but based upon longitudinal epidemiological studies, we have some data. So if I have cancer and I'm stressed out, will it contribute to my poor outcome? Does stress contribute to poor outcome in people who get cancer? And David Batty and colleagues, George David Batty, is again out of UCL in London, did a longitudinal analysis of 16 studies which were hetero unpublished. And again, what they showed was people in the highest distress group compared to lowest distress group seem to have this problem, which means they seem to get cancer more commonly. And the hazard ratio of being distressed and having cancer was as bad as smoking and obesity. So food for thought, nothing dramatic, but food for thought. Again, a very interesting paper, is it better to be rich or relaxed? In the bone marrow transplant world, it has been shown quite categorically that if you were rich, your survivals were better versus if you were poor, if you underwent bone marrow transplant for the same indication. It is generally assumed that rich people like Mr. Sethi here and others who have been funding this organization are more relaxed in life, right? Unlike the other plebeians, right? So if you are rich and you have a bone marrow transplant, you tend to be having a better outcome. And what Jennifer Knight and co-workers from University College of Medicine in Wisconsin did, they investigated this with a genome called CTRA, which essentially showed that patients who were stressed, who were socially isolated, depressed, or they had greater sympathetic nervous system stimulation tended to do poorly compared to those people, because CTRA was a genomic profile. So when you are stressed, your genome profile is altered. And that genome profile is called CTRA. Genome profile, for those of you who don't know, is the genetic architecture of your cells in the blood. That is genome profile. So those who were stressed acquired the CTRA profile and they did poorly. So as I said, clearly there is some data to link stress and cancer. Yes. So are we already 25? Oh, so quickly we'll go to stress. I just want to tell you about three things: the autonomic nervous system, the predictive coding, and the neuroplasticity. New ways to look at stress from a neuroscience perspective. Autonomic nervous system is your autopilot. It's your GPS, okay? This is the accelerator and the brake in your car. The sympathetic nervous system, essentially what it does is to drive your body forward into action, into agitation, into a tunnel vision. And the parasympathetic is when you cool down after that massage. That's the parasympathetic system taking over. So this is a David Huberman slide. And as you can see, the stress is one point along this arousal continuum. This is what I was in the morning. Right? When you are stressed, you are panicking. This is when you will be asleep tonight. This is the state which is aspirational. And this state essentially is a distinct balance between the sympathetic nervous system, the accelerator, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brake. I think we'll skip this slide because there's a lot of neuroscience involved. And I quickly want to come into this is where, imagine all of you are taking a walk in this beautiful autumn forest, and then you hear the rustle of a sound. What is the first thought that it will come to you? The first thought of a rustle when you taking a walk through a forest. So Dharmanand Garu is, so based on past experience, you will see, oh my God, this could be a snake. And your sympathetic nervous system is going to go into overdrive. You'll pull up your pants and you'll buckle up and you'll run for your life, right? So what is happening is those sensory impulses are coming in, getting conditioned in the brain, and the brain conditioning is driving the sympathetic nervous system. However, it could be that there is no snake, in which case you would feel relaxed, continue your walk, and the parasympathetic nervous system will take over. So this is an analogy, and I want to spend a minute on this slide, no matter how much time I take, is because when you see a fire, there's a smoke alarm, there's a fire brigade, and there are people who come in and douse the fire. The analogy of stress is very simple. Stress, real, imaginary, learned stress. Oh, I'm going to face Mr. Bamzai today, my MIS is not good. That's learned stress. So when you face stress, which is real, imaginary, or learned, what happens is the eye sees it and relays the signal to the brain. Now, brain, it does not go to the visual cortex, even though I'm seeing Mr. Bamzai. What it goes into the thalamus, where it undergoes contextualization and processing and goes to the fire alarm, the amygdala, and the bed nucleus of stria terminalis, BNST. And they say, oh my God, you have not performed. You are going to get ripped again today on the 30th of this month. And then it sends the signal to the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and the chemicals start dumping in, the noradrenaline, the adrenaline, and the cortisol. And what they do, they hijack your mind. You are sweating, your heart is racing, your muscles are tensed, you're breathing rapidly, as I was just before this talk. So that's what, amygdala hijack happens, the great chemical dump. And you say, you call up Dr. Mr. Bamza and say, I'm sorry, I'm not well, I have a sore throat. Can I do this next week? So you have a flight, or when he's questioning you, you freeze. Rakesh is going to be very upset with me after the talk, I think, because he's absolutely not like that. So that's what stress is. Stress is a visible stressor, the amygdala, and the chemical dump. Just want to quickly show you this. Cancer doesn't develop overnight. It's a step-by-step, multi-modal, non-linear process that develops over years. And stressors allow these cells to gain immortality by acquiring what are called the hallmarks of cancer. And Robert Weinberg from Mass General and Cambridge Institute, who got a Nobel Prize, incidentally, in the 80s, was the first one to define what are the characteristics that convert a normal cell into a malignant cell. And it has been shown beyond a reasonable doubt that stress affects all these hallmarks. So clearly, stress has the ability of initiating and promoting cancer through direct DNA damage. We'll not go into this slide. It's a very interesting slide, but it's a complex slide. So in the interest of time, we'll skip it. We'll skip this as well. Just one quick word. We all talk about genome. Let's talk about exposome. What are the sum total of all the influences that range from what you faced when you were inside the uterus of your mother to the real world? All the exposures together constitute and lead to possibility of cancer and other health illnesses. So clearly, environment, our conditioning, plays a very major role. And Gary Miller out of Columbia is an expert at it. His recent book, The Exposome, is out there on Amazon. I encourage you to read it if you haven't. Finally, what is the way forward? What is that you can use and waste this talk to change your life in future? Regardless of the validity of the ideas I presented in this talk, I hope some of you will be convinced that we need to look at immune system and emotional diseases in a new, different way. And this is clearly how the blind man and the elephant story. Well, we'll skip to, this is what Nanda does over the weekends after surgery, which is meditation, music, and Himalayan yoga and retreat and exercise and whatnot, Asian spa. But Andrew Huberman, the lady spoke every day, but Andrew Huberman out of Stanford has told us that the cure for stress lies within. Okay, the secrets can be locked in within. And we are talking about two SOS levers, and I think more speakers we're going to be actually talking about. One is about visual cues, and the other is about breathing. I leave it to Dr. Nagratna, who's going to be speaking at the meeting as well, to talk about both of them. I just want you to remember a few things which I've always followed, not always followed actually. I should follow always. Let me repurpose your internal struggle. We all need to go through a process of inner re-engineering. Don't sweat the small stuff. It's okay. It's okay not to be the boss's apple of the day. It's okay to not be the best in class. It's okay to not have a BMW or a house in Sunnybrook or Epsilon or be the most beautiful woman on the planet Earth. It's okay. Don't sweat the small stuff. This is also going to pass. We need to notice that we are stressed, take a deep breath, shift and rewire. Okay? Stress is temporary. It can be modulated. We talked about Kabir. Kabir is one of my favorite Sufi saints, and I don't know if this is an appropriate forum for this, and those who understand Hindi will relate to this. And this talks about the fact that we need to understand the temporariness of life and the fact that we need to get happy with minimalism and not maximalism. We'll skip this slide, we'll skip this slide. And finally, the last slide, I know Dharmanand is just going to kill me if I don't. Some people would gladly exchange their best days with your worst days. And this is a Turkish photographer, Aslan, who got a prize recently about a Syrian refugee and his son. And you can see the father is on the crutches and the son doesn't have legs. So some people would gladly exchange their best days with your worst days. And again, another Turkish photographer, Galenicus, does contrast photography. And how beautiful is that contrast? You see a war-ravaged Syria and your fancy bathrooms with Goler fittings, and you say, oh my God, the water is too cold, right? And you see again women schlepping hundreds of kgs of firewood and coal, and people going to Target and Walmarts and Costco's of the world and buying goods. And again, an example of contrast photography. And finally, don't worry, be happy. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm sorry for having taken so much time.
All good things have to end. And this is a conference by itself. And I think Dr. Vineet Gupta has given us a lot of points to ponder over and good books to read. So thank you very much for the enlightening talk. And we'll move on to the next talk.